environmental response in your work. So I'm Naomi, I'm the Principal Consultant for Strategy at MPC and also Programme Manager for Everyone's Environment. And that's the kind of hat I'm wearing today as I lead this training. Hopefully you will know from the kind of event description as you signed up that this isn't a workshop that's going to teach you how to reduce your organisational emissions. We're also not covering how to align any investments or endowment that you have with environmental goals. If those are things you're interested in, that's great. There are great organisations doing that, but that's not what we're doing and that's not what we're talking about today. So we can include some signposting if you are interested in those areas. What we will be focusing on today is how non-environmental organisations can understand how their mission will be affected by environmental change and plan for how their programme design, their strategy, their advocacy work might need to change in response. This is going to be a really hands-on session, so I'm going to do a bit of presentation at the start, then we're going to move into 2 practical exercises for you to participate in and work on, and then there'll be some time for questions at the end. So why are we here? Why does this matter? Well, the fact is that we face a climate and nature crises, and environmental impacts and the kind of implications of those crises are not solely the domain of environmental charities. We know that every person and every part of life is going to be affected. But also we know that not all people are going to be affected in the same way. So the impacts we're going to see in the UK are likely to exacerbate existing inequalities and disproportionately affect the kinds of people that charities tend to work with. Alongside that, if we are going to succeed in environmental transition, we need people from across all of society to be involved in creating the solutions. But currently, involvement is limited to particular parts of our society, and there are whole social groups that are going to be worse affected that aren't having their voice heard sufficiently. We really need this to change to ensure the success of environmental transition and to prevent negative policy impacts on the people that we as charities support. But also to make the most of this enormous period of change that we are going to go through. There's real potential to kind of harness the environmental transition to also tackle social and health issues alongside environmental ones. We are finding through our work that policymakers are increasingly receptive to this involvement and want to hear from different voices. So we as charities need to be ready to step up to that. So what is the role for charities, for social charities in the environmental crises? We see this as kind of 2 core roles. So the first is around supporting different social groups with the impacts of the environmental crises. And this means that your programmes and your services must adapt. So if you're a housing charity providing housing advice, kind of broadening the scope of that to include advice on how the environmental impacts are affecting housing. The second is around empowering different social groups to be part of the solution. And so that includes kind of raising the voices of your users, empowering people to be confident spokespeople on environmental issues, and also incorporating an environmental lens in any existing policy and advocacy work that you do as an organisation. So who are we? I mentioned I'm the programme manager for the Everyone's Environment programme, but not much beyond that. So why are we leading this session today? So I work for MPC, which is a consultancy and think tank for the social impact sector. And as an organisation, we convene the Everyone's Environment programme. So that is a collaboration of more than 80 social and environmental charities that are really looking to accelerate the action that I put on the previous slide. So helping organisations really accelerate the work they are doing to change their programs, their strategies, their advocacy, and to empower their users to have a voice. We know that there are lots of pressures on charities, so our job as a program is to basically make this as easy as possible for organisations. So we provide tools, research, hands-on support, guidance that try to help this be easier for organisations to do. And also we try to play a coordinating role to prevent duplication across the sector. So whilst we really want to accelerate action and we want everyone to be doing more, there's no point everyone just rushing in and kind of doing the same thing. So we try to kind of keep that bird's eye view of what's happening and do some coordination behind the scenes. Last year, we launched the Everyone's Environment Pathway. This was because we saw that a lot of people were concerned about the impact of climate change and nature loss on the people that they served, but people just didn't know where to start. It's an overwhelming topic, and they needed a kind of practical step-by-step solution to work through. The Everyone's Environment Pathway is this. So it's a guide for how you can help for how your charity can respond and for how to encourage your organisation to take this practical action to support the people you serve. So we know that a lot of the people that engage in everyone's environment or in this as an issue might not be kind of chief executives or trustees. They might be really passionate champions. So it's both about what the steps you need to take are and also how you can influence your organisation and your peers to do more. So within the pathway, you find practical tools, signposting to resources, case studies of other organisations and what they're doing, and also a bit of troubleshooting around common concerns and how to address them. It's designed for 3 audiences, as I mentioned. So across all of these audiences, we really stress that you don't need to be an environmental expert to kind of dive into this work. What we need is people who are experts in your cause, whether that's disability or children and young people or arts, culture and heritage, to really engage with this issue and think about the overlap between your social impact and environmental impacts. And it's really important to kind of bring that expertise and the lived experience of the people you serve into these conversations. Within that, we look at 3 core audiences. So I mentioned these champions, and almost every charity we've seen who are acting on the environmental crises began with one kind of passionate champion, someone who was really keen to do more, was willing to push others to kind of do that. And those people can have any day job within the organisation, and often we see kind of have a remit for environmental action on top of their current job, slightly side of desk, and over time that might become an official responsibility, a dedicated post. Someone else might be recruited to lead it, but to begin with, it takes someone really kind of taking ownership and driving this forward within their organisation. The second audience we had in mind when we wrote this guide is senior leaders, who have a key role to play in giving this agenda the resource and prominence it required to accelerate action. Without this leadership, action just won't happen or will be incredibly difficult. So we really need to kind of see senior leaders and with our peers kind of committing to this agenda. And then the final audience that we had in mind as we wrote this pathway is trustees. So trustees have a kind of moral obligation to act. This is going to be incredibly important for every social mission. And so there is a kind of a real need for trustees to be thinking about that. But they also have legal obligations to act in their charity's best interests. And that includes kind of looking outwards, thinking long term, managing risks, and the environmental crisis is kind of all of those things. And so today, that really requires action on how the environmental crisis is going to affect your charity's purpose. So the pathway has 4 steps, and this is going to be kind of the structure for the session today, that we think organisations need to go through. We see all of these steps as kind of equally important and closely connected, and we wrote it in a step-by-step way, partly because of what we heard from the people we are working with around we just need a really clear step-by-step guide of what to do, but it might not always for every organisation make sense to follow it in exactly this order. So you could jump in wherever feels right for your organisation, or follow every step in order, or kind of treat it as a cycle and go back and repeat steps as your understanding and confidence grows or as you tackle different topics. So it's always there to help you with your next step, and it probably will never take you to a fixed final destination. So the 4 steps we're going to go into in a lot more detail, but just at a high level, they are to explore how people are impacted by our changing environment and related policy, to reflect with users how their lives could be improved and your mission advanced by environmental action, to take action to evolve your programs, your services, your advocacy as part of updating your strategy, and then to learn from emerging issues, changing needs from your peers. And that might, as I say, then feed back into further exploration, reflection, and future action. So in today's session, as I say, we're going to dive into the detail of each of the steps that we work on. There's going to be 2 exercises. So the first is going to be an exercise helping you to explore and reflect, and the second will be around acting and learning. And we will have some quiet reflection time. There's a worksheet that my colleague will share in the chat for you to kind of work through and really apply it to your organisation. And then at the end, as I say, we'll have some time for Q&A. So if you have any questions as I'm speaking, please do pop it in the chat and we'll make sure we pick those up at the end of the session. So without further ado, zooming into the first step, explore. So this is where we kind of consider how the people we support are impacted by our changing environment and related policy. And within this, there are some key questions you probably want to think about. So how the people you serve are going to be impacted by climate change and nature loss, and separately, how they might be impacted by environmental policy. This might lead you into conversations about the extent to which the issue that you tackle might become either more prevalent, more complex, more pronounced, or all of those things in coming years because of the environmental crises. That might feel all a bit doom and gloom. So I think it's also helpful in this first step to think about what the opportunities might be from social and environmental action to bring about positive changes for the people you serve and the environment. For champions in this stage, it's really about growing your understanding through research, identifying where there's insight from existing work, either from your organisation or out in the wider sector, talking to peers, understanding what they're thinking, how they're seeing a connection from the environmental crises into their work. And then really sharing that widely within your organisation and trying to grow that understanding generally. For senior leaders, it's about communicating the importance of this work and listening to your champions about what they are learning. If you don't see that champion kind of identifying themselves and you see this as really important, you might want to assign someone to be a kind of staff or a trustee champion to take the lead on this work and understand the impacts for your organisation and for your users. For trustees in this stage, it's about making space on the agenda for exploration of the evidence and discussion of the impacts. So it can be very easy for our board meeting agendas to get very full of, compliance and fundraising and finances, but actually just carving out a bit of space to hear the findings from any research that's happening, to discuss what that means for you as an organisation. To help you do this, there are lots of resources out there already. So as part of Everyone's Environment, we have already put out research on the impacts of the climate and nature crises and related policy on young people, disabled people, older people, ethnic minority communities, people in poverty, health inequalities, people in the criminal justice system. And later this year, there will be research on LGBTQ communities and women and girls. So there's lots of kind of research out there, and some of those we also have kind of high level visual summaries for each group, which can be really helpful for starting some of those conversations with peers who might be less engaged and less likely to dive into a kind of 30-page Word document. There is also lots of sources of local intelligence to help you understand place-based impact. So there's great mapping of how different areas are going to be affected, and you can kind of build an understanding of your organisation based on who you work with and where you work. It's also helpful to think about what insight you might already have or how you might be able to contribute to growing the evidence base. So whether you can do a bit of analysis of the data you collect through a helpline, for example, about where this is already coming up and what people are already talking about, and what you might be able to share openly, because generally there is not enough evidence on the social impacts of the environmental crisis. So I think we all have a responsibility as organisations to be as open as possible, to share this as widely as possible. I've just included a case study on this slide of the organisation's Friends, Families and Travellers that works with Gypsy, Roma and Traveller communities who kind of have done this really well. So they noticed that Gypsies and Travellers living in a caravan site hadn't been considered in emergency planning during a period of floods in York, which prompted conversations about how the environmental crises were going to affect the community they support. They then kind of commissioned internally a piece of research to help kind of grow evidence on this topic. And to lead some insight gathering and existing conversations about kind of what do we already know, and then how can we grow that through conversations, and produced a briefing on kind of that group specifically, which they've used internally to inform their response, but they've also shared with peer organisations working with the same target audience to help grow their understanding. So once you've done that exploration, it's time to reflect with your users how their lives could be improved and your mission advanced by environmental action. So in this step, the key questions are around kind of what the people you support, your peers, your funders and other key stakeholders feel about the impacts and what are their priorities for action. It's building on that kind of positive framing to think about how environmental action could actually help you to address historic inequalities or prevent new inequalities from arising. Thinking about together in kind of discussion, thinking about how the environmental crises are going to affect your organisation and work, and beginning to join the dots about what that actually means for your mission, for your strategy, for your programmes and for your influencing. So as a champion, you might in this step start those conversations with your colleagues and with your service users. That doesn't need to be a whole separate user involvement process. You can think about how you're already talking to the people you support and build in kind of an environmental lens on some of those conversations. And we've got a conversations toolkit that can help you do that, even if you don't feel super comfortable with talking about environmental issues, if that's not your background. In the second step, for senior leaders, this is the time to really be quite decisive about what the relevance of the environmental crisis is for you, and to assign time, resources, and accountability to colleagues for kind of leading, planning, and taking this forward. So it's all well and good to have kind of listened to the learning and be like, oh yes, well that does affect us, but actually decisively giving this the time and resource that it needs to move forward. And again, for trustees, making time on the agenda to reflect on the connections between the evidence and organisation's mission, to act as a sounding board for your chief executive as they begin to make those decisions about what that means for your work, and even to hold them to account if they're not giving this the kind of time and resource that is required, showing them how important it is from the board. Some tools to help you do that. So there's lots of tools out there for strategic reflection, things like the 3 Horizons tool or the flower diagram. These are all linked in the pathway, that can help you kind of draw connections over longer time frames or between issues that you might not normally see as being connected. Through Everyone's Environment, we have some findings briefings, which are kind of collation of consultation that we did with young people, disabled people, older people, and ethnic minority communities about their priorities for action. So if any consultation is not going to feel is not going to be possible for you at this time, then using those as kind of a proxy may be useful. And as I mentioned, we have that conversations toolkit to help you consult with users if you can. And as I've already said, it's really helpful to just think about how can you start to build an environmental lens into existing forums and structures, rather than feeling like you have to completely start something new. Just having it as a topic on the agenda, as a prompt in an existing question, as a survey question in something you're already putting out. So one organisation that we worked with a few years ago, they do a kind of postal survey once a year with the people that they support, and they just had one question on there about the environmental crises, which gave them a really rich data set with which to inform their work. We've also included an example here of the Race Equality Foundation. I think we've got someone from REF with us here today. And kind of showing how they drew those connections, which were prompted by the introduction of ULEZ and the kind of perceived inequalities in the impacts of that policy on ethnic minority communities. REF felt very passionately that the answer wasn't saying no to ULEZ, but ensuring that there was a kind of consideration in that policy design of the impacts on ethnic minority communities. That was the thing that kind of got environmental issues onto the agenda of the organisation, but that prompted a much wider piece of reflection by the trustees. And now they've kind of updated their strategy and their theory of change to ensure that all work that they do considers those connections. Great. So that is enough of me talking. I promised you interactive exercises, so we're going to go to that now. So the first exercise we're going to have about 10 minutes for, and this is really about identifying what your hypotheses are for how you think possibly the environmental crises might affect your user groups or the work that you do. And then identifying some sources of evidence to help you test those hypotheses. Sorry, my computer's just glitching a little bit. And that might be kind of data, that might be insight that's published, it might be reports, but it also might be people that you want to speak to as you test those hypotheses internally, externally, your peers, your service users. And then as you've worked through that, I'd like you to think about what your kind of 3 key actions after today would be to kind of take that forward and really explore and reflect on the connections between the environmental crises and your mission. So I'm hoping you all have the worksheet, which will allow you to do that. And I'm just going to start a 10-minute timer with some, it promises relaxing music. If it's not relaxing, I can turn it off, but just to kind of help you think those questions through for your organisation, for your context. As we go, if you have questions or you want help to get started, please just come off mute and say so, or pop something in the chat, and I'm here to help. I will start the timer now, and hope everyone has the worksheet. I'll just check the chat now.
I've posted a link to it in the chat. Are you able to
Oh,
see the chat
okay.
at all? There should be a link at the bottom of your screen that says chat.
Okay. Okay, I'll scroll up and see if I can find it.
Let me know
Thanks.
if you've got any issues. Thank you.
Okay. I was nervous that it was suddenly going to do something really unrelaxing at the end. So I've just paused that and we'll come back together. I hope that was a useful exercise and it's helped you kind of start thinking and making some of those connections for your organization. Is there anyone who might feel happy to share their thinking, kind of talk us through who you work with, some of your hypotheses, and then what you're going to do coming away from this session to explore that further? Feel free to pop your hand up.
I would. Oh, it's Tracy from Race Equality Foundation. I can't see whether.
Go for it,
And
Tracy.
okay, I will try. I'm not sure if it's going to make a lot of sense. So we are a national charity. We work to improve the experience and outcomes for Black, Asian, and minority ethnic communities, and we tend to look at evidence and develop interventions and then disseminate this practice. So, in terms of our focus area, it's around health and care, housing, sort of generally public services, and we work with Black, Asian, and minority ethnic communities. So, in terms of my hypothesis, and I'm not sure if I've written them very well, so the first one is around air pollution. So, are those living in areas of deprivation more likely to be affected by air pollution? The second one is probably similar, which is around poor housing conditions. Sort of poor housing conditions will affect specific ethnic groups more. Sorry, poor housing conditions are more likely to affect specific ethnic groups than others. So that's another one. I didn't do the third one very well, so I'm going to ignore that. Um, and in terms of the evidence to test this, I think speaking directly to these communities, looking at research evidence, whether that's local or national data, but also looking at what they call grey evidence, which is ones that are not sort of representative of the communities, but maybe a local organisation has done that. Also speaking to specific organisations that are Black-led in terms of the political term Black minority ethnic, such as the Muslim Charities Forum, who might have evidence. So those are some of the suggestions, and I think I've already said this, people to test the hypothesis with probably local authorities, environmental organisations, local communities, and the priority action that I've only got two. One is around exploring the evidence, so to actually look at the evidence, but in a wider context. So we're not just looking at national data and local data, but like I said, speak to Black-led organisations working on environmental issues, and as importantly, speaking to the people who are going to be impacted. So speaking to the communities from the different minority ethnic groups. So
Great.
that's a bit of a summary.
Thank you, Tracy. And yeah, just thinking about your hypotheses, there's the kind of how the environmental crises are going to affect the issue of housing and poor housing, and then who is kind of disproportionately affected. So there's probably going to be slightly different evidence on the different
Yeah.
parts. That's great to hear. Anyone else happy to share? Denise.
Hello, thank you. Hi, Tracy. I haven't seen you for a long time.
Hi.
Hello.
Oh my gosh.
I
This
know.
is this is exciting.
I
All
know. Look
right,
at me.
okay. I'll let you
Uh,
speak.
thank you. Right, let me just put my hand down so it doesn't confuse me. Um, so we are the National Network for the Education of Care Leavers. That's what it says on the tin. And our focus is getting more young people from care backgrounds into and through further and higher education so they can have secure lives. And our core user groups are young people from with local authority care backgrounds, college and university widening participation teams, and local authority leaving care teams. So our so my hypothesis, I think, is so we know that our young people will end up living in poor housing. So whether that's social housing, rented, or emergency accommodation, we know that they have low incomes, so affording heating bills is going to be really difficult, and air pollution. So we also already know that our young people will be living in areas with no green spaces, and they're already a traumatized group of people. So the evidence to test, I think, so actually going back and looking at that care leaver employment and education data and understanding where our young people end up. Speaking to the care leavers themselves, because I'm thinking that no one's probably actually asked them at all about this, and also looking at that local authority modelling. I think we need to speak to the Department of Education and also to Department of Environment to see whether anybody has ever collected this data. Same with social service housing teams, who will be the people who are mostly housing our young people, and have a look at some PhD papers to see whether any research has been done already on this, because I expect that someone has done a PhD on it. So priority actions to really understand the landscape and to have some conversations with our own team and our Student Voices network, just to see what our young people, just to really understand our young people's experience, so that we keep that at the heart of whatever we do next. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much for sharing, Denise. I wonder if there's also a kind of upstream hypothesis, or it's just all a bit doom and gloom, but thinking about how potentially some of these impacts might affect who is going into care and who is therefore a care leaver longer term. So I know there's
Oh
some
yes, yeah, no,
out there about kind of the trauma of extreme weather events and the kind of impacts on kind of societal issues that
absolutely.
link to care. So I wonder if there's some kind of understanding some of that and how your target groups might change.
Yeah, thank you.
That's great. Anyone want to finish this off, or we'll move on? Annie.
Hiya. I was looking more at how um, environmental policies might negatively impact people on low income. So maybe slightly different to the last two people. I work for an organisation called the Poverty Alliance. We're based in Scotland, and our focus area is preventing and reducing poverty across Scotland. We're a network organisation, so we've got like over 400 members. So um, the main hypothesis I was thinking about was that energy policies moving to clean energy has a negative impact on households on low income financially, and how we can look to gather more information around that. And I know that for sources of evidence to test that would be, I know Citizens Advice Scotland have done a lot of work around that, because they've got a lot of data about people coming to them about like when local authorities are wanting to change people who are maybe on gas or maybe off gas mains grid and have home heating oil, they're changing those to electric heaters, which is really, really expensive and pushing people into fuel poverty and debt. And also other sources of evidence would maybe be the Joseph Rowntree Foundation doing an awful lot of work around this too. So they would be people for us to speak to also. And then also in Scotland, there's an organisation called Environmental Rights Centre Scotland, who do a lot of really great work. And I guess speaking to our own network, but specifically, and I think linking into what Denise said there, speaking to our participants. So we work with people who are on a low income. The project that I work on is focusing on rural Scotland. So we've got a really large participant bank, and we support them with whenever we work with them, we support them financially to take part in these discussions. And I guess if we're having discussions with these, it's who to feed that evidence back into if we are collating evidence to make sure that it's being used well. And then priority actions, I think thinking this all the way through is a social tariff for people on low incomes. If people are being pushed towards electric, and we want to encourage that move to clean energy, they need to have a social tariff to be able to afford that. So who are the partners to build a campaign around that with? Hope that
Love
was
it. You're
useful.
leading us on to the next bit there, Annie, with thinking
Oh,
about actions. But no, but that's great. And I think the other thing I'd say with that kind of policy lens in mind is thinking about some of those key policies in the Scottish context that are around kind of the move to renewable energy, and just looking at to what extent are they thinking about considering the needs of people on low incomes. How could you potentially influence, change some policy, like you say, with the social tariff to bring that in? But it can be helpful to look at evaluations and things like that just help you see what those impacts have been to date. Thank you so much, Tracy, Denise, Annie, for sharing and being brave to do that. That's great. It's really helpful to see very different examples, different organisations of how these connections are relevant. I'm just going to reshare my slides and then we'll move into part 2, which is around steps 3 and 4, acting and learning. Sorry, my Zoom is being annoying again. Let's see if I can get this working. Great. So step 3, acting to evolve your programs, your service, your advocacy as part of updating your strategy. So as we've just heard a great example of what that can look like, a campaign to build in a social tariff. That's a really clear action that you can do. So the next step is really thinking about, for your organisation, where are those obvious spaces for action? Where are there quick wins? Where are the things you can actually really easily do? That might be a kind of small tweak to one of your programs just to incorporate environmental considerations within it. It might be a tangible thing that you can offer to people in this space. There might be things that you kind of know you need to do but aren't sure how to approach it. It feels much too big and too overwhelming, and that could be a longer term priority where you kind of work through this pathway in a bit more granular detail to get there. There might be things that feel like they naturally fit within your current strategy and programs. So that's, as I say, those kind of tweaks, things you're already doing, that kind of, it's a really obvious fit. And then there might be things where actually you think longer term, our strategy, our programs and our advocacy might need to change more fundamentally to recognise this kind of different context that we are moving into as an organisation. For champions in this step, I think the biggest influence you can have is understanding how existing activity can evolve to incorporate that environmental lens. It's probably going to be more within your power to make those tweaks rather than the transformations. For senior leaders, I think it's in your power to kind of launch and be bolder about some of those transformations, to commit resource or commit strategically to that work. But also, as we heard there, kind of thinking about what unlikely coalitions you might be able to build across sectors and interest areas. So actually, if you're a poverty charity and you see this real need in having a social tariff and in the transition to renewable energy, who can you build relationships with in the environmental sector or in the housing sector to take that forward and kind of move beyond your usual networks? And then for trustees, it's really about making sure that as and when the time comes to renew your strategy, that this is really embedded as a core commitment within that, and that you are holding your leadership team to account to actually doing things. So as I said earlier, not just kind of going, oh, well, that's all very interesting, but we've got a lot going on, but actually moving this forwards. So some examples of that. First, some resources. So there's lots of guidance out there about kind of strategy development. We think that those all still apply. You just have to kind of have that openness to environmental issues and that lens in your mind as you go through that, making sure, for example, that it's a key question you're discussing as you go through that process. There are also public commitments you can sign up to for environmental action. So if you're a funder, there's the Funders Commitment on Climate Change led by ACF. If you're a chief executive, there's a pledge led by Akivo, and those can be really good in holding you to account and in connecting with you with a peer community to help you move forward these actions. And throughout, we're really thinking about how can you bring an environmental lens to all your planning and decision making, not keeping this as a separate, oh, we do this one project over here. An example I really like of this is from Reach Volunteering. So they have kind of got to the stage where the environmental crisis is really centred in their strategy. They have a kind of language of a sustainable future, which includes both the climate crisis and equity within that. This kind of has ensured that environmental action and that lens stays front of mind for them throughout, and that's led to a kind of really natural evolution. So those who don't know Reach Volunteering's work, they run a great kind of online marketplace for volunteering roles to connect volunteers and charities, and they launched a Volunteer for Climate campaign, which highlighted all of the opportunities on their sites for people to use skills for climate action on a voluntary basis. And that started with kind of highlighting what they already had there, but also encouraged organisations to think about how they could use volunteers in their work, how they could embed that. And that's now a kind of permanent fixture. They have a kind of core part of their work looking at how people can volunteer for climate. As you kind of take actions forward, take your programs forward, take those tweaks forward, it's really important that we continue to learn from emerging issues, from changing needs, and from your peers and from your users. So throughout this, we need to be mindful of kind of what is changing in the national picture, how is progress to net zero going? What are the policy impacts? What new policies are coming out that might affect people? Thinking about, where you are making progress on some of these social impacts of the environmental crises and where are we maybe having less impact. Continuing to listen to colleagues, peers, the people we serve about how these things are affecting their lives, what their priorities might be, and how you as an organisation can respond. And just keeping an ear to the ground for opportunities that might be emerging or risks or unintended consequences of the work that you are doing. For champions, that's really about kind of just being proactive in sharing learning with your colleagues and peers, continuing to champion that agenda even if the work is underway. For senior leaders, we really encourage that people be brave in listening to feedback, being transparent in learning. And for trustees, that environmental insight is really built into what you're drawing on when you come to do a strategic review, so that you're not just kind of doing your usual, we go to these data sources, but making sure that that is one core input into the strategic decision making of your organisation. Again, there are resources to help you do that. Again, we just think established processes for measurement and evaluation and learning can still apply here. You just have to be asking the right questions about environmental issues as part of the questions you are already asking. And there are forums out there for kind of shared learning and working. And if there isn't one that appeals to you, you can set one up. So there's a great collaboration in the young people's, I'm going to completely butcher what they would call their sector, but young people's outdoor education sector, where they kind of wanted a really specific collaboration. They meet regularly as a kind of a dozen organisations to share their learning as they take forward this work. So it could be that you join an existing network, or it could be that you establish one for organisations in your local area or in your cause. I think it's really important to kind of use what you are learning to inform your and your peers' activity. So in the care leaver example, if you're having those rich conversations and getting that understanding where people just haven't been asked before, doing what you can to share that with organisations that might not be able to do that work directly. So an example here from Groundwork, who many of you might know were set up specifically at this intersection of social, environmental and economic challenges. And so they kind of had that overlap front of mind in their early days, but found as the organisation grew, it was doing more activity that was just social or just environmental or just economic. And when it came to a strategic refresh, Groundwork kind of spotted that drift had slightly happened and created, by using environmental insight, by using insight from kind of thinking about the overlap in that process, they began to kind of systematically consider how they could draw those three elements back together again and really think about where there could be benefits in multiple areas for the young people they support. And that's then led on to really impactful programs such as the New to Nature scheme, which encourages people from diverse backgrounds into the environmental sector. They've also done a great job at sharing the learning from that really widely. So if you're doing anything around recruiting people from diverse backgrounds into environmental work or into your organisation, I really encourage you to look at the New to Nature website, because they've been really generous with what they've shared in that process. Great. So we're now going to go on to our second activity, which if you kind of scroll down your worksheet will appear. And this is about thinking about the actions that you might take and whether those are kind of tweaks or transformations. So you're invited to kind of list the key activities that your organisation is currently doing, thinking about where there could be a link to environmental work, whether that would be a small tweak, a transformation, or new activities entirely that are needed. There's also space to think about who is working in a similar space to you. So who can you learn alongside? Who are your fellow pupils? And how practically might you share learning in those groups? And again, there's space at the bottom to set some priorities for you to take forwards. Again, we're going to have 10 minutes. I will start the timer and stop and give you 10 minutes. Again, people will have space to share some examples, so do think about whether you might be happy to share. Okay, we'll come back together. Anyone happy to share any ideas for actions potential tweaks, transformations, new programs, or for potential ways of sharing learning and who you might do that with. Who wants to be brave?
I'm so sorry, I really abhor silence. So when silence is being held, you know it's going to be me that jumps in.
You're
Um,
the chair's dream, Annie.
yeah,
That's great.
well, um, so part of Poverty Alliance's work is every year we run Challenge Poverty Week in Scotland. And as part of that, we tend to look at involving members in different activities. And we run like thematic talks and events throughout the week. So I guess I'm thinking about how we can bring in our membership organisations who are maybe doing more work around environmental justice and see if there could be a focus where they could come together and engage more with people who are doing more solidly social justice work and try and encourage those relationships between our existing member groups. So thinking about speaking to the campaigns team about how that would look in terms of shaping messages and stuff for Challenge Poverty Week.
That sounds fantastic. I know from the work that we did on poverty in Scotland, including with Poverty Alliance, there was a lot of demand for kind of just making space for some of those conversations with often very grassroots frontline poverty organisations to help them kind of feel equipped to do some of that work. So that would be a great way of doing it. Anyone else want to share ideas for actions or for ways of sharing learning? Can't see you all, so do feel free to just come off mute or share something in the chat. I know we had one message from Anne at the Brixton Windmill around kind of the sessions they run on wind power to children and adults and tours of the windmill to talk about how wind energy works. That's great. I actually live just by Brixton Windmill, so I didn't know you did that, and I'll try and come along to one. And it's great to think about how we can use kind of community assets to draw connections to things that might feel quite removed from people's lives. So for people living in Brixton, they might not think of wind power as being super connected to their lives, but using that as a kind of gateway, it's great to see. Thanks for sharing that, Anne. Any other ideas for things you might change about your services to kind of embed a bit of an environmental response?
To share what I've put, I think it's quite a classic maybe approach to organisational change. So I'm not sure there's anything like super exciting in what I wrote. Maybe that's good though, because actually maybe what we just need to do is just focus on some of the basics. So one of the things I did kind of reflect on actually when I started going through this is what we've never done as an organisation is do a carbon audit. So I'm wondering if there's something about just having some evidence and fact around where the biggest proportion of our carbon emissions comes from. So then that when we're talking about priority actions and where to focus on, you're actually focusing on the things that make the biggest difference. And there's quite a lot of talk in our sector. So I work for one of 43 active partnerships that are all based across England. They're not in Scotland, I'm afraid, Annie, and any other Scottish or non-English colleagues on the call. But we talk a lot about kind of having to start with ourselves and having kind of the foundations in place as an organisation, almost as a stepping stone, if you like, or having that foundational stone in place before feeling almost entitled to have that conversation with maybe suppliers. We don't really have service users as such. We're probably structured a little bit different to maybe some of the other organisations on the call. So yeah, so there's some stuff around there around carbon audits and where do the biggest emissions come from, and then control what we can control, and then focus on those things first. Be that stuff that we're buying or services that we're commissioning out. So yeah, that's probably kind of where my energy went to this one.
That's great, Ellie. And we can share some resources. As I said at the start, we don't do so much on kind of greening operations and things like carbon audits, but there are lots of organisations that do. So we can signpost you to some things that might make your life easier. I think I'd also think in the kind of active partnership space, and I know that across the network, you do a lot of work on kind of bringing people who are furthest from physical activity towards it. And so I wonder if there's kind of actions and thinking about how the environmental crisis may create further barriers to some of that, and then how some of that service across your network might need to change. But don't want to that's just the other kind of thought that's prompted, knowing a little bit about your work. Thank you for sharing.
It's very no, it's an endless, relentless conversation, I think, around the absolute recognition that the people who are least active and struggle to be active are those that are always suffering the greatest inequality with that, social, economic, generational, gender injustice. And so it's all kind of part, I think somebody put in the chat earlier, they were interested to think about the intersection between all of this stuff and how that works. But no, definitely those that experience the greatest burden and have the least means to do something about it are absolutely our target audience. It's just trying to connect those conversations together that I think people struggle to do.
Yeah. And making people feel confident if they only kind of feel they know something about part of that puzzle, and still having that conversation, I think, is something we try to support people to, still open those conversations, even if you're not an environmental expert or a poverty expert or a disability expert.
I agree. I like that.
That's great. Thank you so much, Ali. Is anyone else happy to share either their actions or any ideas they had for how they might share learning?
Hello, I'm going to be brave and share some actions.
Two brave people. Who's? I'll spotlight you. Is that Catherine?
Hello, yes, my name's Catherine. I am one of the grant making team at the Two Ridings Community Foundation in Yorkshire, and we are a funder who have to encourage donations to be able to give the funding out, but also have a certain proportion of our own endowment to be able to make those grants. We're not a massive funder, but we do support a huge range of local grassroots, small, medium and charities on our patch. So I guess the background there is because we are really keen on supporting those local, smaller charities in our area, but we don't have a lot of funds to spend on extra. The environment's not extra, but we don't have a lot of funds to spend on extra things. However, what we do like doing, as well as grant making, is funder plus type things. So we really encourage our applicants to come to us to support, and we run things like monthly drop-ins. So although we don't have necessarily a lot of money to put for extra grant making, what we can do is do things like identify and share resources. So when people come along to those drop-in sessions and they're saying, but we're a tiny charity with £3,000 income a year, what can we do? We can at least signpost some resources to them, and maybe that will spark ideas. And the other thing we can do in those spaces is create networking opportunities for those organisations, because they're all of similar sizes. So it's no good a £10 million income charity saying to a £10,000, we did this. But if we bring together those organisations of a similar size, that information will actually be relevant and proportionate to them. So it may not be earth-shattering and world-changing, but maybe that just sharing of information and encouraging of, well, we had this problem, here's how we solved it, is a step in the right direction.
Absolutely, that all sounds fantastic. You've reminded me of, I don't know if you know Nick Addington, who runs the William Grant Foundation up in Scotland, but he's quite he's great, basically. And he talks about the 7 I's that they think about, and you've touched on lots of them there when they think about how they kind of encourage a response in this space. And so that's kind of ranging from recognizing their influence as funders and kind of encouraging people, informing charities, getting them to kind of think and understand, inspiring them with examples, what other organizations are doing, kind of inquiring and having some of those conversations. So those drop-ins sound like a great way of doing that. And asking grantees kind of regularly what they're doing and how it's working. They try to, where they can, kind of invest a bit in infrastructure. So whether that's a bit of training or a bit of support for people, or giving a little bit extra money to meet some of the costs of providing this overlap, although recognizing that can be difficult, that funders have constraints too. The one I that they don't do, but that he includes in his 7 I's, is kind of incentives, and like where there's an actual tick box requirement to do work in this space. And I know the lottery, National Lottery Community Fund, I think is slightly more at that end of the spectrum, but I don't know, just sharing some of those I's, because when he shared them with me, I was like, That's great. That's a really helpful and clear way of
like that. Thank you. And I suppose the big, slightly woolly long-term aim might be to transform our donor development and try and find, encourage, align ourselves with donors who do want to at the least embed environmental work into everything that we and the people we support do. So maybe there's that little bit of extra funding for building in environmental elements into projects, or even maybe much bigger question, and obviously just me, do we try and attract funders precisely for environmental projects? Is that part of our remit in the long term? But that's a huge aim.
Yes, well, that's great. We like, so I say it can be little things, it can be enormous things, but if it's got your ideas flowing, that's great. Heather, you wanted to come in next. Oh, you're on mute, Heather. Sorry. Can I unmute you?
Hi, so sorry I missed earlier on. I got caught up with an operational thing, but I just want to say one of the things we've been looking at. We're a local Age UK, so I'm Heather. I'm the CEO of Age UK Shropshire, Telford and Wrekin, so local charity. And obviously we've got an environmental action plan, and we work away on it, and it's a sort of coalition of the willing, and we're all very enthusiastic and work quite hard on it. The conversation we were having last week was about the fact that more outward facing, that we are an organisation who engages with a lot of older people, and how can we engage older people as environmental activists? So there are lots of them out there. I know a 92-year-old just around the corner who's a member of Extinction Rebellion, and she's definitely a activist with a large A. But it's sort of, I guess it'd be good to share any experience people have of engaging environmental activists with your own organisation, both to shape what you do, but also as influencers to kind of influence what's going on locally and nationally, really, around this. So I just wondered if that's an experience anyone's had.
That's great. I'll let that question go to the group if anyone has any examples to share. But also I'll say, Heather, that we did some specific consultation. I don't know if you've seen it. It's a couple of years old now, but with older people about the ways in which they want to be engaged and participating in environmental action, and kind of countering that stereotype of them not, people not caring so much or being less engaged. That's absolutely not the case. And I think there's a real role for charities working with older people, both in kind of channeling that energy and giving the opportunities to do it, as you say, but also in helping provide the kind of information and advice, and also the peer information and advice, so that people can respond to the impacts they're feeling. Because the people we spoke to have really lovely examples of just by having a space to go, oh, I've actually found this really helps me in times of extreme heat, or this is a solution that's worked. Those kind of peer-to-peer conversational spaces.
I think two strands we see when we talk to older people. One is the impact it has on older people themselves, as you say, in terms of heat, extreme cold, flooding. We're in a big flood zone, but also a lot of people who feel very passionately that they want to leave the world a better place for their grandchildren, and they don't want to be seen as the generation who let everything go to hell in a handcart, sort of thing. So they want to campaign and lobby and be engaged, and often they have the time. So how do we utilise that? How do we build on that, and signpost people to where they can be most effective with that?
Yeah. Is there anyone on the call who has an example to share of how they've kind of rallied the people they support in kind of campaigning and advocacy terms? Or if not, there's some people I'll connect you to after this, Heather.
Thank you.
Share. If not, we've sort of drifted from the kind of sharing back from the exercise into the last 20 minutes of this. I had just earmarked for any questions or discussion or calls to the group. I don't know if we have any in the chat so far, James, or if anyone wants to just come off mute and kind of ask anything you might be wondering.
No questions in the chat just yet, but please do share in the chat or raise your hand.
If not, I'm sorry.
Go on, sorry. I was going to say, if not, there are a couple of things in people's intros that I thought could be helpful to pick up on. So there's one about how to kind of demonstrate environmental sustainability in kind of bidding when that's not part, like the main focus of the work. Another on how, I suppose, the flip side of that, which is as a funder, if you're interested in the environment and you kind of fund lots of people whose main work isn't about the environment, how do you kind of embed it as a focus in a kind of proportional way?
Yeah, so those are both really good questions. I think from the fundraising side, I think it's where those early stages of the pathway can really help if you're really clear on that narrative of how you know the people you support, the work you do is going to be affected by environmental change. It's easier to kind of weave that into a proposal or an application that isn't explicitly about the environment, but you can have that kind of thread through it, and that might then be reflected in a particular aspect of the program design that you're putting forward, or kind of how it fits into your wider work as an organization. I think it doesn't need to be, that you're applying for a bells and whistles environmental project, but it's just showing that you're mindful of that. There might be a few additional costs or an additional element to what you're doing. And I think that's when it can be really helpful to have those conversations internally and really be on the same page about what is our kind of environmental story, how does this affect our work, and make sure that everyone's kind of on the same page and understanding that and communicating that in the same way, whether it's in fundraising applications or in your external communications or with the people you support. From the funder side, I guess we've touched on it slightly. This is something that we support funders with a lot, and I'm very happy, Irina, to have a chat, and I'll try and share those 7 I's about kind of keeping it proportionate, not suddenly saying, well, every funder should be an environmental funder, but also recognizing that whatever you fund, this is relevant to your mission. And so there needs to be some response, and whether you choose to be a kind of inspire funder that's just giving stories and case studies and supporting your funders in that way, or whether you're going to require a response and make that a condition of funding or whatever it might be, but deciding internally on what your role is against that. That makes sense. I'm happy to answer any follow-ups because those were a while ago. Any other questions, reflections, asks of the group? If not,
Hello, I'll just say really, really quickly that, and I'm still formulating my thought.
Yeah.
We have a environmental sort of approach, but that's been very much focused on our organisation is sort of really inward facing and not outward facing. So just having that poke to actually think about.
Yeah.
So we absolutely know how our young people are impacted, but even weaving this into why our young people having the tools to have successful independent lives, it all, this is a big part of it, as well, because if we're lifting them out of poverty, it's doing all of this. So very good start to my day. Thank you very much.
I'm glad to hear it. I think it's I absolutely don't want to diminish the kind of the role of looking at your operations or thinking about your investments, but I think we were set up as a program essentially because we saw a lot of energy going in that direction from charities. And actually, if you're the average charity in the UK has not very many staff and maybe an office, but it's small, and the actual environmental footprint of the charity sector, because we are resource constrained, that means we're also sort of carbon constrained. And so I think actually the much bigger impact that we can have is through kind of supporting the people we support across the UK to really transform their lives and play a role in that green transition. So it's great to hear that that's kind of maybe slightly nudged you towards that from the kind of more inward looking perspective. And I think for your organization, Denise, there's obviously so much connection, I think, around
there's so much. It's just
all of the areas around housing or green jobs and skills, and ensuring that what's happening as that all changes so rapidly is actually appropriate and is going to empower care leavers and allow them a chance to kind of build fulfilled lives going forward. I think
but also to reduce like the we already know that our young people are, have shorter lifespans, so, and increased mental health issues. So it impacts in every area of their lives.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
thank you.
absolutely. And I think it can be really helpful in those conversations you might have to kind of understand their real key priorities, the real issues in their lives, and then to think about what the environmental kind of drivers or connections with that are, rather than going in and going, right, who wants to talk about climate change, when actually people are like, don't care, or it's not my biggest issue. Yes, that's great. If there's not any final questions, I will just slowly draw us to a close. Feel free to jump in with any if you have, but I know a few people are jumping off for other meetings. So
we have one hand up,
oh,
Naomi.
Irina,
Last
sorry.
question. No, it's all right. Thanks, Naomi. I just wanted to ask about environmental policy writing, both for funders and for charities. I think it's a big thing that's being asked of on both sides. And I think a lot of people have old ones that talk about kind of like printing and recycling and things like that. But now people are looking much further, much deeper at the thematic overlap between environment and whatever it is they're working on. And if there's any support in articulating it in a policy way is quite difficult, I think, for everybody. Is there any support in that? Have you got any advice into how to articulate it in terms of a policy?
That's a really interesting question. And I'm wondering if any MPC colleagues on the call have seen it written in that kind of policy format, because I'm not sure I have, but I think we could do some digging for you and maybe share some examples, because I think absolutely the environmental policies can be like, yeah, this is our recycling bin sort of level, and not systematically articulating some of the kind of it is. So I think that's probably going to be one to leave with us, and we'll see what we can pull together. Because
thank you. I think it kind of sits as the main outward facing document for a lot of organizations on what they're doing. And I think we just need to get it right.
A good place to start is probably some of those the pledges that are public facing, so the funders' commitment on climate change and the Akivo kind of leaders pledge. I think will have maybe some of the language and some of the things you would want to pull out. But yes, leave that with me, and I'll share it with
thank you so much,
everyone if we can find anything, because I know others are saying yes, please. Thank you. Great. So thank you all so much for joining us today. This has been a really enjoyable conversation, and I hope it's kind of prompted some ideas, some ways that you could get started and made embedding an environmental response in your work feel less intimidating. So next steps for you, take those things forward, have those conversations, do some of that research, think about how this might look for you. If you ever want a kind of one-to-one conversation or any support from us, we are always here. I will pop my email in the chat shortly. Some next steps from MPC and from everyone's environment that might be of interest. Last week we announced that we've got a new kind of 3-year funding commitment from the National Lottery Community Fund to continue this work, and that's with a specific focus on empowering people from ethnic minority communities who are living in poverty and disabled people to become spokespeople in the media and policy on environmental issues, and also in supporting grassroots and local organisations to kind of take forward environmental action. So if you're interested in that, you can drop us a line and we'll kind of keep you in the loop as that evolves. As part of that, there will also be new research briefings focusing on LGBTQ communities and women and girls. So as I said, those will be coming out later this year, if that's relevant to the people you support. Yes, and just be in touch. Let us know if we can do anything to help. We're really, really passionate about this area and keen to take things forward. When you close this call in a couple of minutes, a feedback survey will pop up. We'd love it if you could just take the time to answer the few questions that come up there, and then you'll get an email in due course with the recording, the slides, the worksheet, and the resources that we mentioned. I've seen there's been a request to save the chat, so I'll pull out any of the key kind of links and comments within there and make sure that that's shared along in the follow-up email. Thank you all so much for spending part of your morning with me today. It's been great, and look forward to seeing you all again soon.